So Europe then faces a clear and present danger on a scale that none of us have seen in our adult lifetime. It's the direct warning from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in a letter to the EU's 27 leaders. As today they hold those emergency talks to agree ways to quickly increase their military budgets. Von der Leyen warning that some of our fundamental assumptions are being undermined to their very core. On the agenda today, a proposition to mobilise €800 billion, as well as discussions over nuclear deterrence. Well, it all follows a rallying call from the French President Emmanuel Macron as he addressed the nation on television last night.
Russia has become a threat to France and Europe. I want to believe that the US will stand by us, but we have to be ready if this is not the case. Whether or not peace in Ukraine is achieved quickly, Europe must be able to defend itself better and deter any further aggression.
Emmanuel Macron there. Well, let's talk about the latest then. With me here on set is Kethevane Gorjestani, our international affairs editor, and Dave Keating joins us as well from Brussels. Dave, first of all then, tell us about the discussion today and what they're hoping to achieve.
Well, the European prime ministers and presidents will be arriving here behind me shortly, and what's on the table is this package called Rearm Europe that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen put forward 2 days ago. Now, it contains 5 measures. One would be relaxing the existing EU debt rules to allow countries to take on debt that would normally exceed EU limits if they're spending on defense. Another is to directly invest in defense from the EU budget using cohesion funds that are normally for poorer regions in the EU. Then there's also a proposal to use some of the lending arms that the EU has in order to directly lend to defense. But these are all long-term measures. What makes this a crisis summit is really the U.S. pulling its support to Ukraine and also seemingly pulling its support for the transatlantic alliance. Now, for that, short-term measures are going to be needed, but we're unlikely to get any short-term measures agreed here today. Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, put on the table a €20 billion surge of aid to Ukraine that was originally in draft conclusions that were being discussed, then taken out, then re-added, but without a reference to the specific number. So there's a big question mark about whether we're going to see short-term funds agreed. From what I've heard talking to EU diplomats, there is agreement on these 5 points that were put forward as this package 2 days ago. The problem is that's long-term. Now, another short-term measure that's probably going to be discussed on the sidelines is this Franco-British idea to have their troops on the ground supporting Ukraine and also for them to be separately negotiating a peace with Ukraine while Trump conducts his bilateral negotiations with Putin. So that will be discussed because both of the President Macron and Prime Minister Starmer has talked about that as a coalition of the willing that other countries could join. Eyes are on Germany, on Poland. And so those discussions will happen here. The problem is that half of that dynamic duo is not here in Brussels at this EU summit because of Brexit. Keir Starmer is not attending this summit. So I wouldn't expect any real progress on that idea for the coalition of the willing to be conducting this separate negotiation with Vladimir Zelensky. President Zelensky will also be joining the EU leaders here today in person. He'll be arriving here on the red carpet shortly.
Kethevane, it follows, doesn't it, Emmanuel Macron's message last night? Tell us a bit more about what he said and what's going to be top of his agenda at this meeting today.
Well, look, that speech was a little bit to explain or re-explain to the French people and maybe to other Europeans why they were going to have to make efforts going forward. It was sort of telling people what's at stake and why it is important to support Ukraine. For Emmanuel Macron, there were 2 elements. One was that supporting Ukraine is not simply the right thing to do. It's also key and vital for both the security of France and the security of Europe, and that down the road, France will have to make difficult decisions today in order to guarantee its security tomorrow. He said we are entering a new era, and for that, he put 2 reasons, 2 countries. The first one, of course, Russia, that he said has become a threat to both France and Europe. He said that Russia was testing our limits, and he insisted questioning those people who are saying that maybe there's still some negotiation to be done with the Russians. Who can believe that Russia will stop in Ukraine? That is really the key of the message, is if you don't stop Russia in Ukraine, it will someday come to the doors of the European Union and possibly of France. The other country that he was discussing in that speech was the United States. Unlike the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who insisted very strongly that the US was still a reliable partner, Emmanuel Macron was a little bit more critical or more clear-eyed, some would say, about where the US stands. He said that what the US had done in the past few weeks had showed that they were changing their positions on Ukraine, changing their positions on the war, and putting doubts into what they would do next. He said, I want to believe that the U.S. will stay by our side, but we need to be ready if that is not the case. And that's probably one of the messages that he and others in Europe are going to bring. Yes, let's try to hold on to the transatlantic alliance, but let's also prepare for what happens. And he had this one sentence that was very clear. And of course, they are going to be in Brussels. That is the capital where he wants things to be decided. He said the future of Europe should not be decided in Washington or in Moscow.
Dave, there is one potential, isn't there, fly in the ointment here. This is Hungary, of course. Viktor Orban threatening to veto a statement in support of Kyiv.
Yeah, that's nothing new. What is new is that in past summits, Viktor Orban was seen by others as representing the Russian position. Now he's seen as representing the American position in conjunction with the Russian position. And the American position is that the Europeans should basically shut up and let Trump and Putin continue with their negotiations uninterrupted. The concern is that if the EU were to give this surge of aid to Ukraine, that actually disrupts the negotiations, seems to actually be going against the negotiations that Washington is conducting. And so Viktor Orban wrote a letter to Council Chairman Antonio Costa last week saying that he viewed the existing draft conclusions on support for Ukraine to be antithetical to that purpose for what he says is achieving peace in Ukraine, and that he would veto that. So that's a key thing to watch today. Now, there's a way to get around that veto. 25 of the countries could agree this on their own. That is, without Viktor Orban and without Slovakia's Robert Fico, who is also against continuing aid to Ukraine. That is possible under EU law. It's just tradition that dictates that the European Council normally doesn't do that. But it has done that in the past with conclusions that have kind of an asterisk and then noting certain countries' objections. The thing is, the Council doesn't like to do that because it sends a message of disunity. It also sets precedent for national governments being overruled. Other national leaders are always very hesitant to cede power over to the EU. But of course, these are exceptional times. Will Viktor Orban be successful in watering down those conclusions or torpedoing conclusions at all? That's the big question. I've heard from everyone yesterday that the ideal situation here is that they can get a full EU27 conclusions adopted, endorsing the measures that were put forward by von der Leyen 2 days ago and endorsing rapid support over to Ukraine. But they're not willing to water it down for Viktor Orban. If they have to, they will go with 25 of the 27.
Dave, thanks. Dave Keating continuing to follow that for us, of course, during the day here on France 24. Kethevane, let's finally just take a bit of a step back. I mean, Donald Trump has certainly, hasn't he, upset the apple cart, really, over Ukraine in the last few weeks. Where are we, or is it just impossible to say?
Well, look, on the surface, especially when it comes to the relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine, things seem to be getting a little bit better, but arguably the bar was set pretty low by the Oval Office meeting. When you listen to the address in front of Congress that Donald Trump gave, he sort of toned down his comments about Zelensky, no attacks there. There are ongoing talks between the Americans and the Ukrainians. There was a call between the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and his Ukrainian counterpart. And Zelensky himself has said that there was positive movement. There might be another meeting, and possibly that signing of the rare earth deal that was not signed in that Oval Office meeting. But this is really the surface, because underneath what you're seeing is, the Americans pausing military aid. There was about $3 billion worth of military aid still in the pipeline from what had been approved under Joe Biden. There's nothing coming up after that, but those $3 billion right now are on pause. They also now announced that they were pausing their intelligence sharing. That is, of course, very crucial to the Ukrainians when it comes to fighting off the Russians. Right now, they can't count on the American intelligence. The French have stepped in. The defense minister saying that France would share its own intelligence, but arguably the Americans may have a little bit more intelligence when it comes to what the Russians are doing. And there is also this report by Politico that says that U.S. officials have actually been in talks with some of the political opponents of Volodymyr Zelensky, including a former Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, all of these opponents are not saying that they want new elections, but the Americans are pushing, questioning about how soon they could hold new elections. So that narrative from the White House of maybe Zelensky should resign, maybe he should call new elections, that the Kremlin has been calling for, is still alive and well. And it really shows the strategy of Donald Trump. It's not about repairing the relationship with the Ukrainians. It's about putting pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky to sign that rare earth deal. Right now, that is the target of the Americans. And when it comes to the Europeans, it's a little bit the same thing. There's pressure on the Europeans because there's another deal to be made, this time with the Russians. And so you have the United States at the same time saying, you, the Europeans, need to take it on your own, need to do it on your own. You do the security guarantees. You deal with what will happen in the future. But we're going to make the deal with the Russians without you. So you see the same sort of strategy when it comes to dealing with the Ukrainians and dealing with the Europeans. The question is how strong the bond between the Europeans and the Ukrainians will be to sort of have a united front when it comes to the United States, and even more so when it comes to Russia.